He was 33 years old, raising a 7-year-old daughter alone, and the last thing he expected was to fall for someone. But she wasn't just anyone. She was 60 years old, ran a billion-dollar company, and carried scars on her body she had hidden from the world for 30 years. One blind dinner, one conversation that lasted until midnight, and one secret that should have ended everything before it began. What happens when a man who has nothing left to lose meets a woman who has spent a lifetime convincing herself she deserves nothing at all? Stay until the end. Hit like, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The sitter canceled at 6:15. Ethan Mercer found out via text. 3 words, so sorry. Sick, with 2 exclamation points and an emoji that he didn't have the patience to decipher, while he was still in his work clothes, smelling faintly of the machine oil that never fully washed out of his hands, no matter how long he scrubbed. He stood in the kitchen doorway reading the message twice, then set his phone face down on the counter and pressed his palms flat against the tile and just breathed for a second. 7-year-old Lily was in the living room watching something on the tablet, oblivious. She had her knees pulled up to her chest and her hair was half out of the braid Ethan had done that morning, and she looked, as she almost always looked to him in quiet moments, like the most exhausting and most essential thing in his world. He picked up his phone and called Marcus. "Sitter canceled," he said when Marcus picked up on the second ring. "No." Marcus's voice went flat immediately. "No, man. You promised." "I know I promised. You promised me 2 weeks ago and then again last Thursday and then again on Monday when I reminded you." "I know." Ethan leaned back against the counter. "The sitter canceled. What do you want me to do?" "I want you to call another sitter." "I don't have another sitter. Jess was the sitter." There was a long pause. Ethan could hear Marcus breathing through his nose in that particular way he did when he was trying not to say something he would regret. They'd been friends since college, long enough that Ethan could map Marcus's entire emotional register just from the quality of his silences. "This woman," Marcus said finally, "is not going to wait around forever." "I haven't even met her." "That's my point. You haven't met her because you keep canceling." "I canceled once." "You canceled once and then rescheduled, and now you're canceling again." "Ethan." Marcus's voice shifted slightly, lost some of its edge. "I'm not trying to be your therapist here. I know what you're going to say. I know you've got a full plate, and I know Lily comes first, and I agree with all of that. But it's a dinner, 2 hours. You haven't been on a date in what, 4 years? 3.5. Oh, 3.5. Forgive me." A pause. "Call your neighbor. The older lady. What's her name?" "Mrs. Park?" "Mrs. Park. Call her. She watches Lily sometimes. You told me that." "She watched her once, when I had an emergency at the shop." "So call her and tell her you have an emergency at the shop." Ethan looked at Lily, who had not moved, who was still absorbed in whatever she was watching, one sock half off her foot. "That's called lying. It's called being a human being who occasionally leaves the house." Marcus let out a short breath. "Look, I'm not going to guilt you. You do enough of that to yourself. But I set this up because you asked me to set something up. 6 months ago you asked me, and I finally found someone who I think is actually worth your time, which is not easy because your standards are... My standards are fine. Your standards are insane, but that's a conversation for another night. Just call Mrs. Park, please. The reservation's at 8. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Through the doorway, Lily laughed suddenly at something on the tablet, a bright, unselfconscious sound, and it moved through him the way it always did. That specific frequency that was equal parts joy and ache. "What's her name?" he said. Marcus took a half-second too long to answer, which Ethan noticed. "Victoria." "Victoria what?" Another half-second. "Ashcroft." Ethan's hand tightened slightly on the phone. Victoria Ashcroft wasn't a name you lived in this city without knowing. She was in the business section of the paper with some regularity, and she'd been the subject of a long profile in one of the national magazines a couple of years ago. He'd read part of it in a waiting room somewhere, remembered a photograph of a woman in her 50s with silver hair cut close to her jaw, looking at the camera with the patient, slightly amused expression of someone who'd been photographed enough that she'd stopped finding it interesting. "Marcus." "Before you say anything, Marcus, she's a person. She's just a person. She's been widowed for 8 years, she doesn't have any kids, and look, I've known her for 3 years through the foundation work, and she's the most genuine human being I've met in a long time. I'm not setting you up with a CEO. I'm setting you up with Victoria. Those are two different things. Ethan didn't say anything. She's nervous about it too, Marcus added more quietly. For what it's worth, he called Mrs. Park. He changed his shirt. He told Lily he had a work meeting and felt the small familiar compression in his chest that came with every half-truth he told her, which was not many, but which accumulated anyway. Lily barely looked up from the tablet. Can we have pancakes tomorrow? She said. Yeah, he said, making pancakes tomorrow. With the little chocolate chips? Sure. Okay. She finally looked up at him, briefly assessed his cleaner shirt, and looked back down. You look nice, she said, with the distracted generosity of a child who has already moved on. The restaurant was the kind of place where the lighting was so carefully calibrated you couldn't tell whether it was flattering or just dim, and the menu didn't have prices on it, which always made Ethan quietly furious because he didn't come from money, and pretending money wasn't a factor had never felt honest to him. He got there 7 minutes early and sat at the table they'd been given near the window and ordered water, and then felt self-conscious about only ordering water and ordered a club soda, and then wondered if he'd been wrong to wear this particular shirt. He'd been on dates before. After Claire left, after the specific, devastating quietness of watching a marriage dissolve, not into shouting, but into an extended mutual acknowledgement that they had made a mistake, there had been a few women over the years, nothing that lasted more than a handful of months. He hadn't been destroyed by the endings, which was maybe its own kind of information. You could miss something without having truly lost it, and most of those relationships had felt, in retrospect, like two people trying very hard to feel something they'd half convinced themselves they should feel. He was thinking about this, somewhat unhelpfully, when Victoria Ashcroft walked into the restaurant. Marcus had said she was nervous, and Ethan had half expected to see that. Some visible uncertainty, some performance of a woman out of her element. What he saw instead was a woman who walked the way people walked when they'd spent a long time learning not to take up too much space, and then slowly, over more years than that, learning to take up exactly the right amount. She wasn't tall. She wore a dark jacket over a silk blouse the color of charcoal, and her hair was silver and close-cropped in the way he remembered from the photograph. And she was looking around the restaurant with an expression that was composed but not cold. She saw him before he had time to stand up. For a single moment, less than a second, really, something moved across her face. Not recognition, exactly. More like recalibration. He stood up. She crossed the room toward him and extended her hand, and her grip was firm and direct, and she said, "Ethan, I'm Victoria," in a voice that was low and clear and completely absent of the particular vocal performance he'd half expected from someone of her stature. She sounded more than anything like herself. "Hi," he said, which was not his most eloquent beginning. The corners of her mouth moved. She sat down across from him and set her bag on the empty chair beside her and accepted the menu from the server with a brief smile. And then she looked at Ethan across the table and said, "Marcus told me you almost canceled tonight." He paused. "He told you that?" "He told me you'd had a childcare situation. I appreciated that he told me. I'd rather know than wonder." She looked at the menu, then back at him. "How old?" 7. Her name's Lily." Marcus mentioned her, briefly. A pause. "He's very careful about what he shares. I noticed that. He's a good friend." "He seems to be." She set the menu down. "I want to say something before we do the usual dinner conversation, if that's all right." "Okay. I've done this, the setup, the dinners, all of this, a few times over the past several years. Not many, but a few. And every time I come in prepared to perform a version of myself that is easier to digest, more appropriate. I'm 60 years old, which in this context means I've had a long time to get good at that particular performance." She said it flatly, without self-pity. "I'm tired of doing that, so I thought I'd mention it up front so that we can both be spared the effort." Ethan looked at her for a moment. "That's a pretty direct opening." "I'm a pretty direct person. I've been told it can be alarming." "It's not alarming." He leaned back slightly. "What does the performance usually look like? The one you're not doing tonight?" She thought about it genuinely, which he appreciated. "Warmer than I actually am at first meeting, more deferential, smaller, generally. I found that people are more comfortable with me when I take up less space, so I developed a habit of—" She paused, and something shifted briefly in her expression. "Editing myself down at the start of things. Letting people arrive at the real version gradually, so the real version isn't too much of a shock. Does it work?" "Professionally, yes. Personally—" She picked up her water glass. "Not especially." He ordered the fish. She ordered the lamb and a glass of red wine and didn't ask whether he was going to order wine, which he appreciated because he wasn't, he had to drive. And women who performed elaborate negotiation around that particular nothing always made him tired. They talked for 2 hours. Not the careful resume exchange kind of talking that happened on most first dates. The trading of edited highlights, the tactful omissions, the mild competitive interest performing. They talked the way people talked when they'd both arrived at an age where the performance felt like more work than it was worth. He told her about the shop, the custom auto restoration work he'd been doing for 11 years, the specific satisfaction of returning something broken to function, the thing it had taught him about patience. She listened without the distracted half-attention he'd grown accustomed to from people who weren't used to listening. She asked questions that indicated she'd actually heard the previous answer, which should not have been remarkable, but somehow was. She told him about the company she ran, Ashcroft Industries, a mid-size manufacturing firm that had been her late husband's, and that she had taken over after his death in circumstances she described only briefly, without elaboration. He didn't press. She talked about the work she found meaningful, the foundation, specifically the burn recovery programs she'd begun funding quietly about 5 years ago, without fanfare, without the elaborate public charity performance she'd watched other wealthy people engage in. "I don't need credit for it," she said. "I just need it to exist." Why burn recovery specifically? A brief pause. Nothing dramatic, nothing performed, just a pause, like someone deciding how close to step toward a window. "Personal reasons," she said. He nodded. He didn't follow up on it. At 10:30, when they'd moved from dinner to coffee and the restaurant had thinned around them, she looked at him across the table and said, "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Marcus described you as a good man. I've learned to apply some skepticism to that particular descriptor when it comes from someone who's trying to set me up." "Reasonable." "You're more—" She seemed to be choosing the word carefully. "Uncomplicated than I anticipated. I don't mean that as a diminishment." "How do you mean it?" "I mean that you're not trying to be something. You're not managing how I see you. Most people manage how I see them, especially in a first context like this, and I've gotten good enough at recognizing it that it has become one of the less interesting aspects of meeting new people." She turned her coffee cup slightly in its saucer, not looking at him. "You came in here as whatever you actually are." "That was either very perceptive," he said, "or very generous." "It was observational." He smiled. She watched him do it. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. "Not tonight, but soon, if we—" She stopped, reconsidered. "If tonight turns out to be the beginning of something rather than the end of something. There's something I've never been comfortable disclosing on a first meeting, and there's a reason I've never gotten past a third or fourth with anyone since Daniel died. I want to be honest with you that the reason exists, even if I'm not ready to say what it is yet." Ethan thought about that. "Okay." "Okay?" she repeated, as if testing the word. "That's your response?" "You just told me there's something you'll tell me when you're ready to tell me. That's fine. Everyone has a thing." He shrugged. "I don't need to know everything tonight." She studied him for a moment with an expression he couldn't quite read. Something between careful assessment and something more fragile than that, something she controlled quickly, professionally, the way she probably controlled most things. "You're either remarkably patient," she said, "or you haven't fully processed what I said." "Probably some of both," he said. "I'm not particularly mysterious." She almost laughed. It was a small thing, contained, but he caught it. "No," she said. "You're not." He called Marcus from the car. "Well?" Marcus answered without preamble. Ethan sat in the parking lot for a moment with the engine running. The restaurant's windows were amber and warm from the outside. He could still see their table from where he was parked, empty now, cleared. "She told me there's something she'll tell me eventually. Something she's been hiding." Silence on the line. Then, "She told you that directly?" Yeah. Huh. Marcus was quiet for a moment. That's new. She hasn't. He stopped. Do you know what it is? No, she said she'd tell me when she was ready. And? And I said that was fine. Ethan watched a couple come out of the restaurant, the woman laughing at something, the man holding the door. It is fine, Marcus. You're not curious? You're not going to look her up or, I know who she is. She runs a company. She lost her husband. She's 60 years old and she's been doing this alone for 8 years. And whatever this thing is, she's been carrying it alone for longer than that. He put the car in reverse. People are allowed to have things they carry alone. Marcus was quiet again for longer this time. You like her, he said finally, and the surprise in his voice was genuine enough that Ethan almost felt offended by it. Yeah, he said. I do. Okay, Marcus exhaled. Okay, yeah, good. Good night, Marcus. Good night. And Ethan? A pause. Don't cancel the next one. Mrs. Park was asleep in the armchair when he got home, the television going softly. Lily was in her bed, already out. He stood in her doorway for a moment, in the dark, the way he'd done almost every night for 7 years. This particular, specific ritual of checking, of making sure, of letting the fact of her rest settle through him like something being set down after a long carry. She'd kicked off her blanket. He pulled it back up. On the nightstand was the drawing she'd done yesterday, a house with a lopsided tree, 3 figures standing in front of it. 2 of them were labeled, in Lily's still uneven handwriting, Me and Daddy. The 3rd figure, slightly taller than the rest and holding what appeared to be a flower, had no label at all. It was just a person waiting to be named. He stood there for a moment longer than he meant to. Then he turned off the light and went to finish the dishes. They had coffee the following Tuesday, at a place she suggested near her office. Small, not particularly fashionable, the kind of place that suggested she went there because she liked it rather than because it was appropriate. She was already there when he arrived, reading something on her phone, and she looked up when he came in with the same brief recalibration he'd noticed at the restaurant, like someone quietly adjusting to the fact of another presence. They sat for an hour and a half. They talked about Lily. Victoria asked questions, specific ones, that made him realize she'd been paying attention to what he'd said the first time. What is she like? What's she afraid of? What's she good at? He told her about the dinosaur phase that had lasted 14 months and then ended overnight when Lily decided, with complete inexplicable certainty, that she was now interested in marine biology. He told her about the morning Lily had climbed into his bed at 3 a.m. and announced that she'd decided she was going to be an oceanographer. And when he'd asked what an oceanographer did, she'd said very seriously, "Studies the ocean, Dad." And he'd said, "I know, but what specifically?" And she'd paused and said, "The wet parts." Victoria laughed at that. A real one this time, less contained. It changed her face. "She sounds like someone I'd like to meet," she said, and then caught herself and added, with the careful precision of someone who knew how that sounded, "I don't mean to get ahead of things." "It's fine," he said. "I've made a habit of not involving myself in anything I can't see a reasonable path through, children especially. I don't want to be someone who comes and goes from a child's life." "I appreciate you saying that. I mean it seriously. I've watched people treat children like they're props in someone else's life, and it's one of the things I find genuinely contemptible." He looked at her. "You're not a particularly soft person." "No," she said simply. "I've never been particularly soft. I've had to make myself more manageable over the years, for business, for social context. But underneath that, I'm fairly direct, and I don't have a lot of tolerance for people who aren't serious about the things they say they're serious about." "Is that why the other ones didn't work out?" A pause. Partly the other thing." She looked at her coffee cup. "The thing I mentioned. You don't have to tell me today." "I know." She was quiet for a moment. "I want to. I'm just—" She stopped. "I'm not used to wanting to. That's the part that's strange." He didn't push. They walked out together onto the street, and at the corner where they'd go in separate directions, she turned to him and said, "Are you free on Saturday? Lunch. Somewhere more casual. I'm tired of restaurants with no prices on the menu." He was so surprised by the last part that he almost didn't answer the first part. Yeah, he said. Saturday works. Good. She pulled her jacket closer in the October air. And Ethan, she stopped herself. What? She shook her head slightly. Nothing. Saturday. She walked away. He stood at the corner for a second, watching her go, not because he was cataloging anything, just because something about the image stayed with him afterward. A woman in a dark jacket walking away from him in the October cold, small against the architecture of the city she'd spent decades building herself into, alone in the particular way that competent people are alone, which is quietly and from the inside. He thought about the unlabeled figure in Lily's drawing all the way home. Saturday was better than the Tuesday, and the Tuesday had been better than the dinner, and the dinner had been better than the 3.5 years before it. Ethan noticed this with some surprise and some resistance. He was not a person who jumped toward things, had spent years training himself to examine his own impulses with some skepticism before acting on them. A survival mechanism he'd developed somewhere in the middle years of raising a child alone, when the cost of bad decisions was no longer something he could afford. But Victoria Ashcroft was not a bad decision. That much seemed clear. She was someone who'd been hurt. He didn't need to know the specifics to read that. You didn't get to 60 carrying the kind of self-containment she carried without having had real reasons for building it. And she was not, under the containment, unkind. She was sharp and impatient and had no particular gift for small talk and held her own comfort zone with both hands. But under that was something careful and genuine, something that paid attention and gave more of its attention than it wanted anyone to notice. He told her about Claire on Saturday, not exhaustively, not in the way that became a wound you insisted on showing someone, but honestly. The marriage had been good at first, reasonably good, and then it had become a thing they'd both maintained out of loyalty rather than desire, and then Lily had come, and then it had become clear that Lily was the reason they were still there, and not a reason that would hold indefinitely. And Claire had finally said it out loud 2 months before Lily turned 2, and they had both been, in the shameful and relief-soaked way of long overdue endings, grateful. Do you hate her? Victoria asked. No, I don't think I ever did. We made each other smaller. I don't know how else to say it, like we each took up less space than we would have alone. Victoria looked at him across the table. That's one of the more honest descriptions of a failed marriage I've ever heard. Were you and your husband... He stopped. I'm sorry. It's a fair question. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. We were good. We were genuinely, honestly good. I don't say that to make him a saint. I say it because it's true. Daniel was the one person in my adult life who knew the full version of me and didn't find it excessive. She paused. When I lost him, I lost the one context in which I didn't feel like I had to edit myself. Until tonight, he said, and then immediately felt like that was too much. But she didn't retreat from it. She looked at him steadily, with the unblinking assessment that he was beginning to learn was just her particular way of taking something in. Yes, she said quietly, until recently. He brought it up first on the 4th meeting. Not the secret, not that. He brought up the age gap because he'd been thinking about it with the particular persistence of something you're trying not to think about, and he'd learned over the years that the things you were trying not to think about were usually the things that needed saying. I want to acknowledge the obvious thing, he said. She didn't look surprised. The 27 years. Yeah, I've been waiting for that conversation. She set her fork down. They were at a diner near his shop, her suggestion again, and he was still faintly amazed by how little she seemed to require that everything be appropriate. What would you like to say about it? I don't know. I want to know how you think about it. She was quiet for a moment, considering. I think it's significant, and I think people will have things to say about it, and I think most of those things will be reductive. I think the part that matters isn't the distance, but what you do across it. She looked at him directly. I also think I'm not interested in protecting my feelings by pretending I'm less invested in this than I am, whatever this is becoming. That's honest. I told you, I'm done with the performance. What I mean is, he tried to find the right words, which was not his strongest skill. I'm not here because you're impressive. I know that sounds strange, but the company and all of it, that's not what this is, for me. I want you to know that. She looked at him for a moment. I believe you, she said. That's actually one of the more unsettling things about you. You're not impressed by things that most people find impressive. Should I be more impressed? No. Something moved in her expression, something quiet and rueful. Absolutely not. He reached across the table and touched her hand briefly. Not a big gesture, just a touch, just contact. And she looked down at his hand and then back up at him and didn't say anything for a moment. There's something I need to tell you, she said. I think I'm ready now. He nodded. He waited. She took a breath, not theatrical, just the breath of someone doing something that required steadying. And then she told him. About the fire. About being 11 years old and asleep in the upstairs bedroom and waking to smoke and heat, and her father's voice through the door. Her father who had gone back in for her mother and never come back out. About the burns. The right side of her body, from her shoulder to her hip. A terrain of scarring she had kept hidden under clothing for decades, had never shown a partner without what she described, with flat precision, as a period of sustained emotional preparation that most people hadn't found worth the wait. She told him all of it without crying, which he suspected was an act of considerable will, and at the end she sat across from him in the booth of that ordinary diner, in the late October light coming through the window, and looked at him with the careful, already bracing expression of someone who has said the thing that ends things and is waiting for the ending to begin. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Is there anything else? He said. She blinked. I'm sorry? Is there anything else you want to tell me? I just want to make sure I have the full picture. She stared at him. I just told you. I know what you told me. He said it gently, not impatiently. I'm asking if there's more. Because you said, there's something I need to tell you. Like it's the thing, the central thing. And I want to make sure I understand what you were actually worried about. She opened her mouth and closed it again. You thought I'd leave, he said. Everyone does. She said it without self-pity, factual. Eventually. Some faster than others, but yes. He looked at her. He thought about Lily drawing that house with the unlabeled figure. He thought about the Sunday mornings when he'd made pancakes with the little chocolate chips, and Lily had eaten them too fast and gotten a stomachache, and he'd rubbed her back in circles while she dozed on the couch. And the utter ordinariness of that scene, and what it had meant to build it alone, to have built it alone for years, to know in your chest that the thing you'd built was real and good, but incomplete in some way you couldn't fix by yourself. I'm not leaving, he said. You don't have to say that to be kind. I'm not saying it to be kind. He said it simply, without drama. I'm saying it because it's true. She looked at him for a long time. The diner was warm and a little loud, and the light was fading outside, and she looked at him across the table the way she'd looked at him the first night. That recalibration, that careful arriving at the fact of him. You're a very strange man, she said finally. I've been told, he said. Outside, the October wind moved through the street, and the light went the color it went in the late afternoon in autumn. That particular amber, and Ethan Mercer sat across from Victoria Ashcroft in a booth in a diner near his shop and thought about what it meant that this was only the beginning, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he wasn't afraid of that at all. The thing about telling someone your worst secret is that the morning after feels nothing like you expected it to. Victoria had expected relief, or dread, or possibly the specific hollow calm that follows a wound being opened and dressed. What she hadn't expected was to wake up at 5:43 a.m. on a Sunday in November thinking about a 7-year-old girl she'd never met, and whether she liked scrambled eggs or the kind with the edges crispy, which was a completely absurd thing to be thinking about, and she knew it was absurd while she was thinking it and still couldn't stop. She made coffee and stood at the window of her apartment, 22nd floor, a view of the city that she'd stopped truly seeing sometime around year 3 of living there, and tried to apply some reasonable structure to what was happening to her, which was what she did with most things and which was working less well than usual. He had not left. That was the fact she kept arriving at. She had told him the thing she always told last, the thing that functioned in every prior context as the moment when a person's face did the small, controlled recalibration of someone realizing they were in something they hadn't fully signed up for. She had watched that recalibration happen enough times to have stopped being surprised by it. She had watched men who were kind, who were good men by most measures, who were not cruel about it. She had watched them simply conclude privately that whatever this was wasn't worth the particular weight she came with. And she had, over the years, stopped blaming them. You couldn't make someone ready for something they weren't ready for. But Ethan Mercer had said, "I'm not leaving in the same tone you used to say pass the salt," like it wasn't a declaration, but just a fact, like it hadn't cost him anything to say it, because it simply happened to be true. She drank her coffee and watched the city come gray and slow into its Sunday morning and tried to decide whether to believe him. He called that afternoon, not a text, a call, which was unusual enough in current practice that she looked at her phone twice before answering it. "I wanted to ask you something," he said, without preamble. "Lily has a thing on Saturday. There's a marine science exhibit at the Natural History Museum. She's been talking about it for 2 weeks. I thought—" He stopped. "I know it's fast. You said you didn't want to be someone who comes and goes from a child's life. And I'm not trying to put you in that position. I just—" Another stop. "She asked about you." Victoria's hand tightened slightly on the phone. "She asked about me? I mentioned I'd been seeing someone. I didn't give her details. I just said there was a person I'd been having dinner with, and she asked if the person liked dinosaurs." A pause. "I said I didn't know. I don't have a strong position on dinosaurs. That's probably fine. She's mostly moved on to marine biology." He was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to. I wanted to offer because she asked, and because I wanted you to know that for me these aren't separate. You and that part of my life. They're not going to be separate, and I thought you should know that now rather than later." Victoria turned away from the window, sat down on the edge of the couch. "Saturday," she said. "Saturday. We usually go in the late morning. She gets tired after 2 hours and starts pulling at my sleeve." "I'll be there," she said. And then, because old habits were genuinely hard to kill, "I might be slightly terrified." "Of a 7-year-old? Of a 7-year-old's opinion of me? Yes. Children are unfiltered." She once told Mrs. Park that her apartment smelled like old cheese and apologies. Victoria almost choked on her coffee. Yeah. "I'll be there," she said again, and meant it both times. She arrived at the museum 9 minutes early and stood outside in the November cold watching the families come and go through the main entrance, strollers, small children in bright coats, the specific mild chaos of Saturday morning with kids, and she thought, this is what I have been outside of for 30 years, not by accident and not entirely by choice. She had built a life that made sense to her, that had its own logic and its own satisfactions. But it was a life without this particular texture, without the small, bright colors of it. Ethan came up the steps with Lily 3 minutes later. She recognized him from across the plaza. That particular walk, the slight forward lean of someone who's spent years carrying things. Lily was ahead of him by 4 feet, pulling slightly at the hand he had on her wrist, wearing a yellow coat and a backpack that had a whale on it, and she was talking, rapidly and continuously, about something that Ethan was responding to with the expression of a man who had been hearing about marine biology for 6 weeks and was deeply committed to remaining enthusiastic about it. He saw Victoria. His face changed. Not much, just a small thing, a settling. Lily followed his gaze. She stopped walking. She looked at Victoria with the complete, uncurated assessment of a child who hasn't yet learned that staring is rude. Victoria walked toward them and crouched slightly so she wasn't towering over a 7-year-old, and held out her hand and said, "Hi, I'm Victoria." Lily looked at the hand, then at Victoria's face. "You have gray hair," she said. "Lily," Ethan said. "No, she does." "It's fine," Victoria said. "I do have gray hair. It used to be darker, but it went gray when I was in my 40s. Lily considered this information. "My teacher, Mrs. Calloway, has gray hair. She's really nice." "That's good company to be in," Victoria said. Lily seemed to find this acceptable. She took Victoria's hand, not Ethan's, Victoria's, with the brisk confidence of a child who had decided something and was acting on it, and said, "They have a giant squid, a real one. It's preserved, but it's real," and pulled her toward the entrance. And Victoria looked back at Ethan over her shoulder with an expression that she suspected communicated approximately what is happening. And he had the look of someone trying very hard not to laugh. The giant squid was, as advertised, enormous. Lily explained things about it with the authority of someone who had done considerable independent research and was aware of the gap between her knowledge and the exhibit's placard. Victoria listened with genuine attention because one of the things she'd learned over 60 years was that children who were given real attention rather than performed attention knew the difference immediately, and Lily Mercer was clearly not a child you could condescend to without her noticing. It says here they can grow up to 43 feet, Lily read from the sign, then looked at Victoria. That's longer than a bus. That's longer than my office. Lily looked at her. You have a big office? It's a reasonable size. My dad's shop smells like motor oil, and it has a calendar on the wall with cars on it and a coffee maker that makes a really loud noise. She said this not critically, but with the cataloging precision of someone describing a beloved environment. What does your office smell like? Victoria thought about it. Paper. And the coffee's better than the noise level would suggest. Lily nodded as if filing this. She moved to the next exhibit, and Ethan materialized at Victoria's left shoulder, close enough to talk quietly. She likes you, he said. She's interrogating me. That's how she likes people. She interrogated Mrs. Park for 40 minutes the first time they met. Asked her why she kept plants if plants just died anyway. What did Mrs. Park say? Said that things dying didn't mean you shouldn't have had them. He paused. She's a smart woman, Mrs. Park. They followed Lily through the rest of the marine exhibit, and then through a section on ocean geology that Lily was less interested in, but powered through with the grim determination of someone completing a checklist. And by the time they reached the small cafe near the museum's east wing, Lily was, as predicted, pulling at Ethan's sleeve. They got hot chocolate for Lily and coffee for themselves, and they sat at a small table with the remnants of Saturday morning around them. And Lily drew in the notebook she carried everywhere while Ethan and Victoria talked in the low, unhurried way they'd developed over the past several weeks. That specific rhythm of two people who'd stopped needing to fill silences. She drew you a picture, Ethan said suddenly, quietly, so Lily wouldn't hear. Last night, she asked me how to spell your name. Victoria went very still for a second. She did? She doesn't draw people she's not interested in. It's a thing with her. He stirred his coffee. I'm telling you because I want you to be prepared so you don't have a visible reaction that embarrasses her when she gives it to you. I'm not generally someone who has visible reactions. I know. I'm still telling you. He glanced at Lily, who was focused on her notebook. She lost her mother pretty early. Not through death. Claire's alive. She's just not present in the way Lily would need. She's never said anything directly about it, but you can tell she's sorted it in her own way, decided it means something particular, made peace with it in the way 7-year-olds make peace with things, which is not always real peace, but something that works for now. He stopped. I'm saying she's not looking for someone to fill that, but she draws people she likes. Victoria looked at the table for a moment, at her coffee cup, at the grain of the wood. I want to be careful, she said. I mean that genuinely. I don't want to be an exciting thing that turns into an absence. I've thought about that. I know you have. I don't know exactly what I'm offering her. I've never been anyone's. She stopped herself. I just want to be honest that I'm arriving at this without a template. Neither did I, he said. Nobody does. Lily looked up from her notebook then, as if she'd felt them talking about her, and she looked at them both for a second with that same clear, unfiltered assessment. Are you two going to keep seeing each other? She asked. Ethan looked at Victoria. Victoria looked at Lily. Yes, Victoria said. I think so. Lily considered this for a moment. Then she tore a page out of her notebook and slid it across the table to Victoria without making a big thing of it, already looking back down at her drawing before Victoria had even unfolded it. It was a picture of 3 people standing in front of what appeared to be an ocean. The 2 smaller figures were labeled Me and Daddy. The taller figure, on the right side, had a small crown of gray scribbled around her head and was labeled in Lily's uneven 7-year-old handwriting, Victoria. The spelling was wrong. Victoria didn't care even slightly. She folded it very carefully and put it in her coat pocket and said, to the table rather than to either of them, Thank you, Lily. You're welcome, Lily said, still not looking up. You can keep it. November became December in the way it did in the city, not dramatically, not all at once, but through accumulated small shifts, the cold settling in for real, the light going early in a way that changed how interiors felt, the particular quality of coming home to a lit window that Ethan had always been quietly grateful for, even in the hardest years. He and Victoria fell into something that wasn't quite a routine and wasn't quite not one. Tuesdays and Saturdays, usually. Sometimes a phone call in the middle of the week when one of them had a thing, a work situation that needed talking through, or Lily had done something that needed to be told to someone who would appreciate it properly. He'd started to notice that Victoria listened differently on those calls than she did in person. That without the social mechanics of a shared space, she was slightly more herself, slightly less managed, and he decided not to mention it because he didn't want her to manage that too. She came to the house for the first time on the second Saturday in December. She stood in the doorway for a moment after he opened the door, looking at the house with the expression she had when she was taking something in, that particular quality of attention she gave things that mattered to her. "It's good," she said, which was not what most people said when they entered a house, but he understood what she meant. It had the material evidence of a life lived in it. Lily's artwork on the refrigerator, a soccer ball by the door that no one had put away, the coffee maker Mrs. Park had given him 2 Christmases ago that he couldn't figure out how to replace because of the way Lily had named it, Gerald. "Lily!" he called. A thunderous sound from upstairs that resolved into Lily, appearing at the top of the stairs, took one look at Victoria and said, "You came!" with a volume and enthusiasm that suggested she'd had some doubts. "I came," Victoria confirmed. Lily came down the stairs not by the conventional method, but by sitting on the top step and bumping down one at a time, which was her preferred approach, and one Ethan had long since stopped trying to correct. She reached the bottom, stood up, said, "Do you want to see my room?" and was already heading back up before Victoria had answered. Ethan looked at Victoria. Victoria looked at him. "I gather that was a summons," she said. "She does that." She followed Lily upstairs. He stood in the kitchen for a moment, alone, listening to the sounds from upstairs. Lily's running commentary, the particular quality of silence that meant Victoria was listening rather than filling space. He put the kettle on. He stood by the window and watched the December street and felt, with some surprise, something that he recognized after a moment as uncomplicated contentment, which was a feeling he hadn't had enough data points on to identify quickly. Victoria came back downstairs 40 minutes later, which was longer than he'd expected. She sat at the kitchen table and accepted the tea he'd made and didn't say anything for a moment. "She showed me everything," Victoria said. "Every single thing in that room. She has a system for her books. Not alphabetical, not by author, some kind of personal taxonomy that she explained to me in detail. She calls it the feeling order." She explained the feeling order. "I'm not sure I fully followed the logic, but I was afraid to say so." "Smart. Once she thinks you're skeptical, she recategorizes you." Victoria laughed, a real one, unguarded, and it still surprised him a little every time. Not because she was incapable of it, but because it came from a different part of her than everything else, some less managed place. "She asked me if I was sad," Victoria said then, quieter. He looked at her. "What did you say?" "I said sometimes." She asked why, at a pause. "I said I'd had some hard things happen a long time ago and I still thought about them. And she said..." Victoria stopped, looked at her tea. She said, "My teacher says feelings are like weather. They change, but they also come back, and that's okay." Another pause. She said it the way children say things that aren't original to them, but have become original to them by absorption. And then she moved on to showing me her collection of sea glass she'd found at the beach last summer. She has it organized by color. "Color order," Ethan said. "Different from the feeling order." She explained the distinction. Victoria wrapped her hands around the mug. "She's remarkable. I want to say that carefully, not in a way that turns her into a thing instead of a person, but she is. She's remarkable. She thinks in a way that's entirely her own. She does. You've done that. Whatever else has been hard or imperfect about the last 7 years, you've done that." He looked at her. She wasn't saying it to be kind. Victoria didn't say things to be kind. She said things because they were true, and you got used to that quickly, or you didn't get used to it at all. I've had help, he said. You've had some help. The daily architecture of it was yours. She looked at him with the particular steadiness that he'd come to understand as her version of something warmer than most people's warmth. You should know that. Somebody should say it to you. He didn't answer for a moment. The kettle was quiet. From upstairs came the sound of Lily rearranging something, a small domestic crash followed by the sound of her talking to herself as she fixed whatever she'd knocked over. Thank you, he said. I mean it. I know you do. He met her eyes. That's why it lands. Gint. Christmas came with the usual controlled chaos of a house with a 7-year-old, which meant the decoration process took 4 times as long as it should have, and involved several negotiations about where specific ornaments were allowed to go, and one brief crisis when the string of lights from last year turned out to have a dead section in the middle. Ethan fixed the lights. Lily supervised. Victoria, who had arrived with a bottle of good wine for him and a bag she gave to Lily without ceremony that turned out to contain a field guide to ocean life and a box of very good colored pencils, sat on the couch and watched this process with the expression of someone watching something they hadn't known they wanted to see. She stayed for dinner. She stayed after dinner. At 8:30, Lily fell asleep on the couch between them. Just went abruptly, completely unconscious the way small children did, her head at some angle that was going to make her neck ache in the morning. Ethan put a blanket over her. They sat, the two of them, in the lit living room with the tree they'd decorated badly and a sleeping child and the particular quiet of a house at rest. This is strange, Victoria said softly, after a while. Strange bad? Strange good. She was looking at the tree. I'd forgotten what this felt like. A house at night with someone else in it. He looked at her profile, the careful architecture of her face, the way the low light caught her silver hair. She was 60 years old and she was the least sentimental person he'd ever met, and she was sitting in his badly decorated living room looking at his sleeping daughter with an expression she probably didn't know she was wearing. Do you want it? He said. This. Something like this. She was quiet for a moment, not evasive, just honest, and honesty for her required a moment's precision. Yes, she said. I do. I've been afraid to want it for a long time, but yes. He reached over and took her hand. She didn't make anything of it. She just let him hold it, and they sat there in the quiet while Lily slept and the December dark pressed against the windows. And for a little while neither of them said anything at all. It was not a perfect moment. The lights had a dead section they hadn't fully solved, and his back hurt from 3 hours of crouching in the attic finding boxes, and there was a dish in the sink he'd forgotten to wash. Victoria's shoulder was tense in the way it got when she'd been managing something all day, and he could feel it in the quality of her hand, the slight resistance she hadn't quite let go of yet. But it was real. It was theirs. And for Ethan Mercer, who had spent 3.5 years reminding himself that real was enough, that real was, in fact, everything, that was more than sufficient. Lily shifted in her sleep and made a sound that might have been a word about the ocean. Victoria looked down at her, and her hand in Ethan's loosened just slightly, like something finally setting down its weight. January arrived the way it always did after a good December. Slightly gray, slightly deflating, the ornaments down and the tree out, and the house returning to its ordinary dimensions. Ethan noticed the shift more this year than he had in previous ones, which told him something about what December had contained. Victoria was the difference. Not in an obvious way, not in the way people talked about love-changing things as though the furniture got rearranged overnight. It was smaller than that. It was the fact that Tuesday nights now had a shape they hadn't had before, that his phone had a different weight in his pocket because it might be her, and he was, embarrassingly, not indifferent to that. It was the fact that Lily had added Victoria, still spelled wrong, and he'd decided privately that he would never correct it, to the rotation of people she asked after, right between Mrs. Park and her friend Danny from school, in the matter-of-fact way she had of incorporating things she'd decided to keep. What he didn't fully account for going into January was that Victoria had her own calendar, and on her calendar, February was a month with a name. He noticed the change incrementally, the way you noticed weather shifting before you could name it. She canceled Tuesday the second week of January, Not unusual. She was a person who ran a company, and companies had crises, and she called him rather than just texting, which he appreciated. Then she rescheduled and came, but was distracted in a way she didn't fully acknowledge, present in the physical sense but slightly elsewhere. Her attention folded inward on something she wasn't offering up. He didn't press. He'd learned early that pressing Victoria was roughly as effective as pressing a wall, not because she was cold, but because she moved toward things in her own time, and you could either trust that or create a problem. Then she missed Saturday. A work thing, she said. Necessary. He believed her because it was always technically true. There was always a work thing, but there was a new quality to the cancellation that he couldn't name cleanly. Lily asked where Victoria was. He said she was busy with work. Lily processed this for a moment and then said, "Is she okay?" With the unnerving directness of a child who was picking up frequencies adults assumed children couldn't hear. "I think so," he said. "I think she's just got a lot going on right now." Lily looked at him. "You should check on her." "I am." "Check more," Lily said, and went back to her coloring. He called that evening. Victoria answered on the fourth ring, which was not like her. "Hey," he said. "How are you doing?" "Fine." Pause. "Tired." "How's Lily?" "She told me to check on you more." A short silence. "She said that. Verbatim. She's—" Victoria stopped. He could hear something in the background that sounded like her office, the particular ambient quiet of a large space where someone was alone at an hour when they shouldn't be. "I'm still at work. It's 9:15. I know what time it is." He didn't say anything for a moment. He had learned to let her silences breathe, to not rush in to fill them, because what lived in her silences was usually more honest than what she put around them. "Victoria." "I'm fine, Ethan. You said that already." Another silence, longer. "There's a period every year around this time leading into February that I find difficult. I manage it. I've been managing it for 30 years. It doesn't mean anything is wrong." "Okay," he said. "What does managing it look like?" "Work. Keeping a full schedule. Not—" A pause. "Not sitting still long enough to feel it." He thought about that. "That sounds exhausting." "It is what it works." "Does it? Work?" The silence that followed was the particular kind that meant he'd said something she didn't have a prepared answer for. "I'll see you Tuesday," she said. "I'm sorry I missed Saturday." "I'm not looking for an apology." "I know." Quieter now. I'll be better on Tuesday." "You don't have to be better. You can just be whatever you actually are." She didn't respond to that immediately, and he could feel her deciding something on the other end of the line, some internal negotiation he wasn't privy to. "Tuesday," she said. "Tuesday," he said. The date of the fire was February 9th. He knew this because Marcus told him, not because Victoria had said. Marcus called on a Thursday in late January, and he didn't open with it. They talked for a few minutes about something else first, one of those conversations where you can feel the real subject waiting in the next room. And then Marcus said carefully, "How is she?" "Not great." "I'm not sure she'd say that, but no." "February 9th is coming up." "I know." A pause. "What happened on February 9th? Marcus was quiet for a moment. "The fire was February 9th. I don't know if she's told you the date specifically." "She told me about the fire, not the date." "It was a Saturday that year. She was 11. The anniversary it's a difficult period for her every year. Some years she manages it better than others." He paused. "She doesn't usually let people get close enough to see how it actually goes." "What does that mean?" "It means she usually makes sure there's enough distance between herself and anyone she cares about that by the time February comes around, the relationship either isn't serious enough for them to notice, or she's pushed them far enough back that they don't see the bad part." Marcus stopped. "You're the first person in a long time who she hasn't pushed." Ethan sat with that for a moment. "She's trying, though." "Yeah, I think she's trying." Marcus sounded like someone watching something from a careful distance, hoping not to affect the outcome by observing it. "She thinks she's protecting you, or maybe protecting herself, probably both. I don't need protecting." "I know you don't. She doesn't fully believe that yet." After he hung up, Ethan sat in his kitchen for a while. Gerald, the coffee maker, dripped quietly. Through the ceiling, he could hear Lily moving around in her room, the soft thud of her walking with the particular gait she had when she was thinking about something, which involved slightly more stomping than her regular walk. February 9th was 3 weeks away. But she came on Tuesday, and she was not better, but she was there, and he understood the difference. She sat at his kitchen table and drank tea and talked about a problem at the company, a supplier relationship that was deteriorating, a board member who was positioning for something she hadn't fully identified yet. And she talked about it with the fluency and precision she always had around work. And he listened and asked questions, and it was on the surface entirely ordinary. But her hands weren't still. That was the thing. She was usually someone whose stillness was physical as well as temperamental, who didn't fidget, who occupied her own body with a kind of deliberate ease. Tonight she kept touching her coffee cup, adjusting it in its saucer, aligning it with some invisible axis, and she wasn't aware she was doing it, which meant it was coming from somewhere below management. He didn't say anything about it that night. He told her about a restoration job he'd just started, a 1968 Mustang in a condition that would have depressed a lesser person, with electrical issues that had so far resisted all logic. And she listened, and some of the tension in her shoulders dropped maybe 15%, and that was enough for tonight. She left at 10. At the door she paused with her coat half on and said, "I'm not trying to disappear. I know. I do this thing, I've been told I do it by more than one person, so I believe it's true, where I preemptively create distance when I expect something painful, so that the painful thing happens to a version of me that's further from the things I care about." He looked at her. "Does it help?" "Not really." She finished putting her coat on. "I just wanted you to know I'm aware of it, in case you're noticing something." "I'm noticing some things." "Okay." She looked at him for a moment. "I'll try." "I'm not asking you to try to be different. I'm asking you to try to stay." The distinction landed. He could see it. She didn't say anything for a second, just looked at him with that particular quality of attention she had, the kind that meant she was actually taking something in. "I'll try," she said again, but it meant something different now. February 9th fell on a Wednesday that year. He knew she had a board meeting. She'd mentioned it 2 weeks ago in passing. That February had the quarterly board meeting, said it without inflection, the way she mentioned things she was already managing. He sent a text in the morning. "Thinking about you today?" Simple. He didn't overload it. She didn't respond until evening. "Thank you." Then 3 minutes later, long day. He called. She didn't answer. He didn't leave a voicemail. The next day, Marcus called him. Victoria was at the hospital. She had collapsed in the parking garage after the board meeting. Her assistant had found her, had called the ambulance. She was stable. Dehydration, exhaustion, blood pressure that had dropped below where it should be. But she was in a hospital bed and her phone was off, and the only reason Marcus knew was because her assistant had called him as the one person in her contact list listed under, "in case of." Ethan was in the car before Marcus finished the sentence. The hospital was the particular kind of fluorescent and beige that seemed designed to flatten everything, the small and the large, the routine and the terrible, into the same effectless register. He asked for her at the front desk and gave his name, and the nurse looked at him with the careful neutrality of someone who was going to check whether he was on a list. He was not on a list. He called Marcus, who called someone, and he stood in the waiting area for 11 minutes, which was long enough that he had time to notice the linoleum pattern and the way the lights hummed and a child across the room who was holding a stuffed bear and watching him with the particular calm of a child who had been in this room before and knew the waiting didn't last forever. The nurse came back and said he could go back. Victoria was in a bed near the window, which wasn't a view of anything except another building's concrete face, but the light was different there than in the center of the room. She was hooked up to a drip, and her jacket was on the chair beside her, and she was very still in the particular way she was still when she was not managing anything, which was rare and which always showed something underneath the management. She looked, not smaller exactly, but more precisely herself, as though without the context of offices and boardrooms and the elaborate architecture of her professional life, what was left was just a person, a 60-year-old woman who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time. She opened her eyes when he came in. For a moment she just looked at him. Her expression did something complicated. Not quite surprise, not quite relief. Something that moved through several registers too fast to name. "Marcus shouldn't have called you," she said. He pulled the chair from against the wall and sat down next to the bed. "Hi to you too. I mean it. I don't need—" "Victoria." He said it quietly, not with impatience. "I'm here. Let's not spend the next 10 minutes on whether I should be." She pressed her lips together, looked at the ceiling. "They're keeping me overnight," she said. "Blood pressure and something about the dehydration. I haven't been eating well this week." A pause. "Or the week before." "Okay. It's not serious." "The not eating thing is a little serious. I've done this before. I know my own patterns." "Then you know this one isn't good." She didn't respond to that. She was quiet for a moment, and he didn't fill it, and what came into the silence was the particular heaviness of a room with a person in a hospital bed, and another person who loves them, and neither of them quite knowing what to do with that. "I hate hospitals," she said finally. "Most people do." "I hate them specifically." She paused. "I woke up in one when I was 11, the night of the fire, and the following days, and then weeks. Weeks of it. The burn unit, the smell of it, the particular sound hospitals have at 3 in the morning." She was still looking at the ceiling. "I know rationally that this is not the same. I know that. But my body doesn't always follow that reasoning." "I know." She turned her head to look at him then. "I kept telling myself this year would be different, that I had more now than I used to, that there were things to, that it would be easier." There's a pause. "It wasn't easier. It was almost harder." "Why harder?" She looked at him for a moment. "Because there are people now. You. Lily. Things I'm afraid of losing." He reached forward and took her hand the way he'd taken it on the couch at Christmas, simply and without event. Her hand was cool. After a moment, her fingers moved slightly against his. "I left them in there," she said, and her voice was steady, but it had the steadiness of something held very carefully, not the steadiness of something at rest. "My parents. I know that's not what happened. I know I was 11 years old and someone carried me out and it wasn't my choice, and they made choices that were theirs to make. But what I know and what I feel have never agreed on this. My father went back in for my mother and the ceiling." She stopped. "I've never forgiven myself for being the one who survived. 30 years, and I've never once, not a single day, thought about that night without feeling like something is owed, like I'm living on borrowed time that should have belonged to them." The room was very quiet. Down the hall somewhere, a monitor beeped in its steady idiot rhythm. "You were 11, he said. "I know." "You were a child." "I know that too." "Victoria." He waited until she looked at him. "You know it, and you don't believe it. That's different from not knowing." She didn't answer. Her jaw was tight in the way it got when she was refusing to let something through. "You've been punishing yourself for 30 years, he said, "working until you collapse, keeping people at enough distance that you can't get too comfortable, making sure you never feel like things are good enough that you'd notice if they were gone." He held her gaze. "You told me yourself. The distance, the managing, running the burn programs quietly without taking credit. Every time something good happens, you manage it down until it can't hurt you when it's taken." Her eyes went bright for a second. Not quite tears, not yet, just the pressure of them somewhere close. "I'm not trying to analyze you," he said. "I'm just saying I see it, and I don't think you're too broken for this. I don't think that. You've known me 4 months. 4 months of you trying very hard to show me the version of yourself you think is most likely to end this, and I'm still here." He said it plainly. "What does that tell you?" She looked away from him again, out the window, at the concrete face of the other building. A long moment passed. "I don't know how to stop," she said. It came out quieter than everything else, scraped down to something more essential. "The guilt. I've tried. Years ago I tried, the therapy, all of it, and it goes away for a while, and then February comes around and it's all still there, exactly where I left it." "Maybe it doesn't go away," he said. "Maybe it just changes into something you can carry differently." She was quiet. "I'm not in a position to tell you how to grieve your parents." He kept his voice even. I don't know what that loss is. I can't know. But I can tell you that the part where you decide you don't deserve anything good because of something that happened when you were 11, that part I don't accept. I don't accept it, and I'm not going to quietly go along with it. She looked back at him then. Her eyes were still bright, still controlled, but something in them had shifted slightly, something that had been facing away, turning, by a degree, back toward him. Everyone else accepted it, she said. Eventually, it was easier than fighting it. I'm not everyone else. No. She looked at him for a long moment. You're genuinely not? He held her hand. She let him. Later, an hour later maybe, the hospital settling into its nighttime rhythms around them, she said, You should go. You need to be home for Lily. Mrs. Park is with her. She knows I'll be late. You called Mrs. Park before I left the house. She processed this. You plan to stay. I planned to be here as long as you needed someone here. He leaned back in the chair. It was not a comfortable chair. He was committed to the chair. So tell me if you need me to go and I'll go. Otherwise, I'll be here. Victoria looked at him for a very long time. He could see her working through it. The old instinct to say, I'm fine, I don't need anything. To perform the independence she'd spent 30 years perfecting. To release him with some gracious phrase that protected them both from the vulnerability of needing. She didn't say any of those things. The night shift nurse is named Gerald, she said instead. Like your coffee maker. He blinked. That's something. I thought you'd appreciate it. Does this Gerald also make a horrible noise? He has a very loud laugh, she said. I heard it from the hallway. They were quiet for a moment, and somewhere in there something shifted between them. Not dramatically, not in the way that would make a good story later. Just the quiet settling of something that had been held at distance, finally being allowed closer. She didn't let go of his hand. Around midnight, she fell asleep mid-sentence, which he thought she would have found mortifying if she'd been conscious for it. He sat in the chair beside her bed and watched the monitor do its small, steady work, and he thought about the 11-year-old girl who had woken up in a room like this without her parents, and what it did to a person to carry that particular weight across 50 years, and what it meant that she was here now, that they were here now, and that she had, for the first time in a very long time, not sent him away. It was not a resolution. He understood that. There was no clean thing that happened tonight that would dissolve 30 years of something that had calcified inside her. She would wake up tomorrow, and the guilt would still be there. And February would still be what February was, and there would be more bad nights and more canceled Tuesdays, and more moments where the old machinery kicked in, and she tried to manage him further than was good for either of them. But she hadn't sent him away. She had held his hand and let herself fall asleep, and trusted him, without saying so, to still be there when she woke up. He was still in the chair when her eyes opened at 6:45 in the morning. She looked at him, and at the room, and at his extremely clear determination to have been there all night. You stayed, she said. Yeah. She was quiet for a moment. The monitor beeped. Gerald, the nurse, laughed somewhere down the hall, loud and uncomplicated. Ethan. Her voice had the roughness of sleep, and something more than sleep. I don't know how to do this. What you're doing. I've never let anyone... She stopped. Started again. I'm going to keep doing it wrong. The distance thing, the managing. I don't know how to just... stop. I know. That doesn't bother you? He thought about it honestly, because she deserved honest. It bothers me a little, but not enough to go anywhere. He met her eyes. We figure it out as we go. That's how it works. She looked at him for a long moment. In the thin morning light coming through the window, with the hospital sounds around them, and the IV in her arm, and the night sitting behind both of them, she looked exactly like what she was. A person who had survived something enormous and carried it imperfectly, and was being asked at 60 to try something she'd given up believing was possible for her. She nodded, very slightly. Just once. It was enough. She was discharged on a Thursday morning with a printed sheet of instructions she didn't need anyone to read to her. A blood pressure cuff the nurse showed her how to use, and the specific indignity of being walked to the exit in a wheelchair because it was hospital policy. which Victoria submitted to with the expression of someone enduring something they found faintly absurd but had decided wasn't worth the argument. Ethan drove her home. She'd told him he didn't have to. He'd said he was already in the parking lot. She'd looked at him from the wheelchair with an expression that was equal parts exasperation and something she wasn't naming, and said, "You can't just do things without telling me." And he'd said, "I'm telling you now." And that had been the end of the conversation. In the car, she was quiet. Not the managed quiet of someone controlling an impression, but the depleted quiet of someone who had been through something and was still inside the afterward. She looked out the window at the February city. Gray-brown and bare, the trees stripped, the light the color of old pewter. And he drove without filling the silence because he'd learned that her silences were often doing work he didn't need to interrupt. At her building, she said, "Oh, come up," without looking at him, and it was not a question. Her apartment in daylight was different than he'd imagined it, which was something he noted without comment. He'd been here twice before, briefly, but not in the daytime, and the light changed what you saw. It was a large apartment, and it was impeccably ordered, and it had the particular personality of a space that had been made to function rather than to feel. Good furniture, precise and uncluttered, almost nothing on the walls except two pieces that he'd noticed before, a framed architectural drawing of a building he didn't recognize, and a small photograph on the shelf near the window that he'd never been close enough to examine. She went to the bedroom to change. He stood in the kitchen and looked at the coffee situation, which was a very good machine that he spent a moment figuring out, and made coffee. And when she came back, she was in clothes that were not her work clothes, softer, less constructed. And she looked at the coffee on the counter and then at him. "You made coffee in my kitchen," she said. "I found everything on the first try. It's a logical kitchen." Well, she sat down at this kitchen island, both hands flat on the marble, and looked at the coffee. "I have a meeting at 2, she said. "You were just in the hospital." "I know where I was." "Victoria." He poured 2 cups and put one in front of her. "You can miss a meeting. It's the quarterly review of the Foundation's burn recovery programs. I scheduled it 8 weeks ago. There are 6 people on that call who reorganized their schedules around it." She wrapped her hands around the mug. "I'll do it from here." He looked at her. He had learned by now to pick the arguments that were worth picking, and he had learned that Victoria Ashcroft doing her foundation work from her couch 2 days out of the hospital was not actually the thing he needed to push back on. Some things were not coping mechanisms. Some things were just who she was. "Okay," he said. She looked slightly surprised, as if she'd been prepared for more resistance. "Okay. But you eat something first. Real food, not coffee." She looked like she was going to argue that too, and then she looked at the mug and said, "There are eggs in the refrigerator." He made eggs. She ate them without commentary, which he took as a good sign. He went home that afternoon for Lily and came back the following morning and the morning after that. He didn't ask permission. He didn't announce himself as a daily presence in a way that required acknowledgement. He just came, in the mornings when Lily was at school, with coffee or food or nothing in particular, and he sat with Victoria while she did what she did, calls, documents, the long and complicated work of running something. And he was there in the way he'd promised to be there in the hospital, which was simply and without fanfare. She tested it twice. The first time was 4 days after she came home. She said, at the end of a long morning, with the particular flatness she used when she was about to say something she'd rehearsed, "You don't have to do this. I know you have the shop and Lily, and this isn't, you shouldn't be rearranging your life around me. I'm capable of—" "I know you're capable," he said. "That's not why I'm here." "Then why?" "Because I want to be." He said it simply. "You keep waiting for there to be a reason that you can find sufficient cause to argue with. There isn't one. I want to be here, so I'm here." She went quiet, that particular quiet. "I'm not a project," she said. "I know that. I'm not looking for someone to fix anything." "Good, because I'm a car mechanic, and I only fix things that fit in a garage." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the neighborhood. She looked at her coffee. "I don't know what to do with someone who just stays." "You don't have to do anything with it. Just let it be." She sat with that for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and went back to her email. And he understood that was the closest she was going to get to agreeing, and that was fine. The second test came a week later, and was harder. She'd been on a call with her board. Not the foundation call, a different one, something about a subsidiary restructuring. And he'd been in the kitchen working on something for the shop on his laptop, and when the call ended, he could hear the quality of the silence from the other room, the particular density of it, and he came to the doorway. She was at her desk with the laptop closed. Her posture was straight, which it always was, but there was something in it that was held rather than natural. She was looking at the framed drawing on the wall, the architectural one. "What's the building?" he said. She turned, slightly surprised, as if she'd forgotten he was there. "The house I grew up in. My uncle had the original plans from when my grandfather built it. He gave them to me after my parents died." A pause. "There's nothing left of the actual house, but the plans are exact." He looked at the drawing, clean lines, precise and small, a house that existed only on paper now. "She sent flowers," Victoria said. He waited. "Margaret Holloway. She's on the board. She sent flowers to the hospital and a note that said she was glad I was resting. That's the word she used, resting." Victoria's voice was even, but he'd learned to listen for what was underneath the even. "She's been on my board for 11 years. She knows I've been running this company for 8 years alone. She's watched me negotiate contracts and manage every quarterly crisis and build the foundation from $40,000 to $12 million. And her response to me collapsing from exhaustion is to send flowers and tell me she's glad I'm resting." She paused. "What she meant, of course, is that she's glad I've stopped, that she's been waiting for an opening." "You think she's moving against you?" "I think she's been positioning for 3 months and that I've been too focused on February to see it clearly, and now she's watching to see whether I recover quickly enough to make it not worth her while." Victoria's jaw tightened. "I've been doing this for 8 years. I know how this goes." "What are you going to do?" She looked at him. "What I always do. Go back in. Show up Monday looking like I spent the week at a spa rather than in a hospital bed." She paused. "I need to be careful about the foundation programs. Margaret has a problem with the burn recovery allocation. She thinks it's insufficiently tied to our core brand. She said so twice in meetings in the last 6 months, and I've been dismissing it because it matters to you." She stopped. "The programs matter to you," he said. "So you've been treating challenges to them as bad faith, and maybe some of them are. But if you go back in looking like it's personal, you'll lose ground." She looked at him with an expression he'd seen before, the one that appeared when he said something she hadn't expected from him, still faintly surprised after 4 months that he was listening closely enough to read back what she'd said through the frame of what she meant. "You're right," she said. It was not easy for her to say. He appreciated it. "What's the actual case for the programs? Numbers? Outcomes?"
Awesome.
She sat up straighter. "We've funded 34 patients through acute recovery in the last 2 years. 11 of them have spoken publicly about the foundation. 3 have gone on to work in burn recovery advocacy." She was in a different mode now, sharper, the fog of the past week retreating from something she cared about enough to be clear about. "The brand argument is specious. Our clients in the manufacturing sector have shown greater loyalty indicators since we began the programs. There's a CSR study that supports it. I just haven't made that case loudly enough because I didn't want to turn something personal into a pitch deck." "Yes." She looked at him. "Yes, exactly." "Make the pitch deck," he said. "Separate the thing you care about from the thing you're defending. Otherwise, you're defending your feelings and they can attack that. Defend the numbers and they can't." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're very practical." "I fix cars for a living. Everything is diagnostic." "That's the second time you've made that comparison." "It's a good comparison." She almost smiled. She turned back to her desk and opened her laptop, and he went back to the kitchen. And for a while the apartment had the sound of 2 people working in the same space, which was a sound he hadn't realized he'd missed until he heard it. The Monday. She went back to the office. He didn't say anything about it being too soon, because it was probably too soon and she was going anyway, and they both knew it. He did show up at 7 in the morning with coffee from the place she actually liked, not the office swill, and she looked at him in the doorway in her full work armor, dark suit, the silver earrings, everything precise and considered, and she looked so completely herself that something in him settled. "You look formidable," he said. I look like someone who was in the hospital a week ago and is doing an adequate job of not showing it. Also that, but mostly formidable. She took the coffee. I'll be late tonight. I know. You don't have to. Lily has a thing at school until 5. I'll pick her up. We'll come by after. She stopped with the coffee halfway to her mouth. You'll bring Lily here. Unless you'd rather... No. Quickly. No, I'd like that. She paused, and something shifted in her expression, a small crack in the armor that she let him see on purpose. I'd really like that, actually. He kissed her on the cheek, which was something that had developed its own ease somewhere in the past weeks without either of them narrating it. She stood in her doorway for a second after he turned to go, and when he looked back, she was still there, coffee in hand, watching him. Ethan. He stopped. Thank you. For the last 2 weeks. You don't have to thank me for... I want to. I'm not good at it, so let me do it when I'm doing it. A pause. Thank you. He nodded. She went inside. The board situation resolved in her favor, which surprised no one who understood her, which was not as many people as should have. She went back in and made the case and made it without emotion and made it well, and Margaret Holloway retreated to a position of public support that fooled probably no one but was sufficient for the moment. Victoria told him about it on a Tuesday, succinctly, without triumph. She described a victory the way she described everything, factually, and without decoration. What changed was smaller than that and more significant. What changed was that she started talking about the foundation programs differently, not in the defensive mode she'd been using when they were under threat, not in the controlled corporate language she defaulted to in professional contexts. She started talking about the patients. She mentioned a young woman, 23, a kitchen fire, significant burns on her hands and forearms, who had been in the acute recovery program and had recently started a small business. She mentioned a teenage boy whose school had been helping with his reintegration and who had, according to a note her foundation director had forwarded, given a presentation to his class about living with visible scarring. She mentioned a man in his 40s who had written a letter to the foundation and whose letter she had read twice. He said something, she told Ethan one evening in the kitchen of her apartment, while he was attempting to cook something with her slightly too minimal collection of cookware. In the letter, he said that for years after the accident, he felt like the scars were something he was carrying for everyone else, that when people looked at them, they were responding to their own discomfort, not to him, and that he'd spent so long managing other people's reactions that he'd lost track of what he himself actually felt about what happened. Ethan put down the spoon, and you knew exactly what he meant. She looked at her hands, both of them flat on the kitchen counter. I've been doing it for 30 years, managing other people's response to it, covering it, choosing clothes and lighting and angles. A pause. Treating my own body like something to be administered. And now? She was quiet for a moment. I think I'm tired of administering it. He waited. I wore short sleeves last week, she said, in my own apartment alone, which shouldn't be an event, but it was. He didn't say anything for a moment. He had learned that there were things she said that didn't need response, that needed the space of being heard and not immediately built upon. How did it feel? He said. Strange, and then ordinary. She looked at him. Mostly ordinary. He nodded. He picked up the spoon. I want to speak at one of the foundation events, she said, not as the executive sponsor, as a survivor. She said the last word with the careful deliberateness of someone who had not previously allowed themselves to use it in the first person. I've been funding these programs for 5 years and I've never once disclosed why. I think... She stopped. I think that's been a form of distance. I've been giving money without giving the actual thing that might make it mean something. Does it scare you? Considerably. Are you going to do it anyway? She looked at him with the particular expression she had when he asked questions she'd already answered in her own head. Yes. Okay. He tasted whatever he'd made, which was not a disaster. I'll be there. You don't have to. I'll be there, he said again, the same way he'd said, I'm not leaving at the diner 6 months ago. Not a declaration, just a fact. She didn't argue. Lily found out about the scars in April, which was not a planned thing. They were at Victoria's apartment on a Saturday. They'd taken to spending Saturdays there on the weeks when Ethan's kitchen was too full of shop chaos, and Lily had colonized a corner of the living room for what she called her research station, which was her backpack, her notebooks, and the field guide to ocean life Victoria had given her at Christmas. And the afternoon had gotten warm enough that Victoria, in the private ease of her own space on a Saturday, had pushed her sleeves up to her forearms without thinking about it. Lily noticed in the way Lily noticed things, directly, immediately, and without the social filter that told most people to look away. "What are those?" she said. Victoria looked down at her own forearms, at the pale, uneven topography of old scarring that ran from her right wrist to just below her elbow. She had pushed the sleeve up without thinking. She could pull it back down and change the subject, and Lily was a child, and children accepted redirections. She left the sleeve where it was. "Scars," she said, "from a fire when I was a little girl." Lily studied them with the same careful attention she brought to the ocean taxonomy. "Does it hurt?" "Not anymore. It did for a long time." "Is that why you always wear long sleeves?" "Yes." Lily nodded, absorbing this. "My friend Danny has a scar on her knee from when she fell off her bike. She says it's her battle scar." She looked at Victoria's arm again. "Yours is bigger." "It is." "That means you survived a bigger battle," Lily said, with the unassailable logic of a 7-year-old, and went back to the field guide. Victoria sat very still for a moment. From across the room, Ethan caught her eye. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. She pulled the other sleeve up, too. Spring came in the gradual and slightly uncertain way it came in this city, some days warm and some days pointlessly cold, the trees making their tentative commitments. Victoria's equilibrium shifted, not completed, not fixed, nothing so clean as that, but shifted. She slept better, which she measured by waking up less at 3 a.m., with the particular consciousness of someone whose nervous system had been running the same alarm for 30 years. She ate more consistently, which she measured by the fact that Ethan stopped giving her the look he gave her when he suspected she'd skipped something. She went to see a therapist, which she told him about in the car one evening in a matter-of-fact voice, watching the street, not making it into anything large. "Good," he said. "I went once years ago and I didn't find it productive." Different time, different things to say. Possibly. A pause. "She's direct. I appreciate that. What's her name?" "Dr. Nwachuk Wu. She has an extremely organized bookshelf, and she doesn't let me run the conversation, which I initially found irritating. And now? Still find it irritating, also useful." She was quiet for a moment. "She asked me what I was afraid of losing." "What did you say?" Victoria looked out the window. "I said you, and Lily." A pause. "She asked what I was afraid I'd have to do to keep you. I said I didn't know. She said that was an interesting answer." "What do you think it means?" "I think it means I'm still waiting for it to cost something, for there to be a transaction, for the moment when staying requires—" She stopped. "When I was married to Daniel, it was different. We arrived at each other slowly over years, and I never felt like I was waiting for the price. But he also knew me before I'd built all of—" She gestured vaguely. "This. You came in through the door of this." A pause. "Sometimes I don't know which version of me you're attached to." He thought about that. Took it seriously, because she'd said it seriously. "The version I'm attached to is the one who came to a blind dinner and told me up front she was done performing," he said. "And everything since. The whole thing, not a version." She turned to look at him. "There's not a real you and a managed you that I'm trying to get past," he said. "It's all you. The competent, scary one and the one who couldn't sleep in February. The one who runs a company and the one who sat in a diner and told me the hardest thing you knew how to say. Same person." She held his gaze for a moment. "Dr. Nwachukwu would like you. From what you've described, she'd probably make me sit with that thought longer instead of just accepting it." "She would absolutely do that." Victoria looked back at the street. "She'd be right to." They drove the rest of the way without talking, and it was the particular kind of quiet that didn't need anything added to it, that was complete in itself. Two people side by side in a moving car in the early spring evening, going in the same direction. Well, the foundation event was in late April. Not a gala, not a fundraiser. A smaller gathering, 40 or 50 people, mostly survivors and their families and the medical staff who worked in the recovery programs. Victoria had done the logistics herself, which was not how she usually operated, but she'd wanted to be specific about it. Low lighting, no podium, chairs in a circle rather than rows. She stood up in front of them and she did not have notes. She said she ran the foundation. She said she had funded burn recovery programs for 5 years without telling anyone in this room that she was one of them. She said the fire had happened when she was 11, and she described it plainly. Not dramatically, not in the therapeutic language of processing, just plainly, in the direct voice she used for things that were true. She said she had spent 30 years treating her scars as something to be managed, and she said she had recently started reconsidering that. She wore a short-sleeved blouse. She didn't say it was easy. She didn't say she had figured it out. She said she was in the middle of it and that she was there because she thought it was worth saying out loud, in a room full of people who would understand it, that surviving was not a debt you spent your life repaying. She said it and she meant it, and it was not the same as believing it completely, not yet, but it was the direction. Ethan was at the back of the room. He told her he'd be at the back, and she'd said she didn't need to know where he was. And then she'd said the back is good without acknowledging the contradiction, and he'd let it go. When she was done, the room was quiet for a moment. And then a woman in the front row, young, maybe mid-20s, with scarring visible on her neck and jaw, started clapping, and it spread, and it wasn't the polished applause of a gala, but the something else kind, the kind that was not about performance, but about recognition. Afterward, in the car, Victoria sat with her hands in her lap and didn't say anything for a while. He didn't feel it. That was the hardest thing I've done since the hospital, she said. I know. It didn't feel like I thought it would feel. What did you think it would feel like? She considered. Like losing something, like giving something away. A pause. It didn't feel like that. What did it feel like? She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the April evening was doing something soft and tentative with the light, the way evenings did in spring when they weren't sure yet whether they were allowed to be warm. Like putting something down, she said, that I'd been carrying for a very long time. He reached over and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held it, and neither of them said anything else, and it was enough. It was in the particular arithmetic of things they'd both been learning exactly enough. Summer came in without asking permission, the way summer did, the city warming up gradually, and then all at once, the trees filling out, the evenings going long and golden in a way that made people remember why they stayed in places that had winters like the one they'd just survived. Ethan noticed the shift the way he noticed most things, practically, incrementally, through the small evidence of it. Lily's school backpack retired to the hall closet. The shop got hot enough by afternoon that he and his one employee, a 26-year-old named Dex, who had very strong opinions about vintage transmissions, worked with the bay doors open and a fan that moved the heat around without doing much about it. Victoria noticed it differently. She told him on a Tuesday evening in June that she'd opened the windows of her apartment for the first time in 3 years, not cracked them, but opened them fully, and had sat near them in the evening with a book she wasn't really reading, just being in the air. She said it the way she said things that mattered to her, but that she didn't want to over-explain, factually and without decoration. And he understood that for her, opening the windows fully was not a small thing. They had found, over the months since February, a life together that was not seamless. Nothing about either of them was particularly seamless. But that was real, and that had its own texture and its own rhythms and its own specific gravity. Tuesdays and Saturdays had expanded into most evenings, some mornings, the slow natural expansion of two people who had stopped needing to manage how much space they took up in each other's days. He kept a jacket at her apartment. She kept a spare key to his house, on a key ring with a small silver squid that Lily had chosen with great deliberateness at the gift shop of the Natural History Museum and presented to her with the solemnity of someone conveying a significant honor. Lily had, over the course of the spring, done what Lily did with things she decided to keep, absorbed Victoria into the ordinary fabric of her world, without ceremony, without the dramatic proclamations that adults used when they were managing their own feelings about a thing. She called her Victoria, not any variation of a parental title, which was something none of the three of them had discussed, and which seemed, in its unspoken clarity, exactly right. She showed Victoria things the way she showed Ethan things, not performing for her, not trying to impress her, just sharing, which was the higher honor. She had added Victoria to the feeling order of her bookshelves, which Ethan discovered only because Lily mentioned it in passing, as if it were obvious. When he'd asked what section, Lily had given him the look she gave people who ask questions with apparent answers, and said, "The good kind, Dad." He thought about that a lot that summer. The good kind. The proposal was not planned in the way proposals were usually planned. He'd thought about it. He wasn't someone who did significant things without thinking about them, and this was the most significant thing he could imagine doing, which meant he'd thought about it with considerable thoroughness over the course of several months, turning it over in the way he turned over a complicated mechanical problem, examining it from different angles, looking for the place where the thing either held or didn't. What he kept arriving at was simple. He wanted to be married to her, not as a transaction, not as a milestone, but because the idea of what his life looked like without the specific gravity of her in it, without the Tuesday evenings and the particular quality of her attention and the way she read in the morning with her coffee going cold and didn't notice. That idea had become not just undesirable, but actively inconceivable, in the way that only things you'd truly absorbed could become inconceivable. He'd also thought about the practical complication of what other people were going to say about it, because he wasn't naive enough to pretend that wasn't a real thing. 27 years was a number that occupied a specific place in the cultural imagination, a place that came with assumptions and projections and unsolicited opinions from people who had no stake in the actual lives involved. He'd had the conversation with himself, thoroughly and without flattery. And what he'd concluded was what he'd concluded about most things that other people had strong opinions about, that the people living the life were the only ones qualified to evaluate it, and that spending your life managing other people's comfort with your choices was one of the less interesting ways to spend a life. He had not consulted Marcus. Marcus had been right about most things so far, and would probably be right about this too. But some things you did not consult other people about, even good people, because they were yours to decide, and the only voice that needed to matter was your own. He'd bought a ring. Not an extravagant one. Not because he was constrained financially, but because he knew Victoria well enough to know that extravagance in jewelry was the kind of performance she'd find slightly exhausting. A single stone well cut on a band that was clean and not fussy. The jeweler had described it as architectural, and Ethan had thought, yes, that's right. He'd had it in his jacket pocket for 11 days before he found the moment, which was not because he was waiting for something cinematic, but because the right moment had a way of arriving on its own schedule. It arrived on a Saturday evening in early October, which was, without either of them having planned it, almost exactly 1 year from the night they'd sat in the diner and she'd told him about the fire. They were at his house. Lily was in bed. She'd pushed her bedtime as late as it would go and then gone down fast, the way she did when she'd burned through everything. And Ethan and Victoria were in the kitchen, the kind of comfortable kitchen evening they'd built over the past year. Him washing the dishes from dinner, and her at the table with something work-related on her phone that she was no longer actually looking at. He dried his hands. He stood at the counter for a moment. He turned around. She was looking at him already, the way she sometimes did when she sensed a change in the room's quality, before it had announced itself. Her phone was face down on the table. "I want to ask you something," he said. She went very still. He crossed the kitchen and sat down across from her at the table. Not on one knee, not with production, just sat down, the way he sat when he needed to be at the same level as something important. And he put the ring box on the table between them. He didn't open it immediately. "I've been thinking about this for a while," he said. Not in an anxious way, just, I kept wanting to wait until I was sure, and then I realized I was already sure, and I'd been sure for a while. And the waiting wasn't about certainty anymore. It was about something else. What else? Her voice was careful, present. "Habit," he said. "I've had the habit of not reaching toward things for years. It was a good habit. It protected me when I needed protecting. But I think I've been using it past its useful life." She looked at the ring box and then at him. "I'm not reaching toward something uncertain," he said. "I know who you are. Not the whole of you, but nobody knows the whole of another person, but enough. I know how you drink your coffee, and I know what February costs you, and I know the way you look at Lily when you think nobody's watching." He paused. "I know you're not easy, and I know I'm not particularly exciting, and I know we are an objectively unusual combination of people. And I know I want this more than I've wanted anything since the day Lily was born." Her eyes were doing the thing they'd done in the hospital. Bright, controlled, the pressure of something just behind the control. "You don't have to answer right now," he said. I know you think about things carefully. Take whatever time, Ethan." Her voice was quiet and very level. "Yeah." "Open the box." He opened it. The ring sat in the box in the kitchen light, clean and unextravagant and exactly itself. She looked at it for a moment. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yeah?" "Yes." Steadier now. "Don't make me say it multiple times." He took her hand across the table and slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit. He'd estimated, because asking would have ruined it, and she looked at it on her hand with an expression he had no precedent for reading, something that moved through several things at once, complex and unmanaged in a way she'd been learning to allow. "It's architectural," she said. "That's what the man said." "I like it." She looked up from the ring to him. Her face was not, in this moment, the composed and managed face of the CEO of Ashcroft Industries. It was just her face, the real underneath the capable, the part that had been showing more often and more easily since February, since the hospital, since the foundation event, and the short sleeves and the opened windows. "I like it very much." He held her hand on the table. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "Lily's going to be insufferable about this," he said. Victoria made a sound that was completely a laugh. "She's going to say she knew. She absolutely knew before we did. She probably has feelings about the wedding venue already. She has feelings about everything already." He looked at her. How are you doing right now?" She considered it, which he appreciated. She didn't reach for the easy answer. "I'm frightened," she said. "Not of you. Of how much I want this and what that means and what could go wrong and the 100 other things that run alongside anything I want." A pause. "I'm also—" She stopped, looked at the ring again. "I'm also something I don't have a good word for. Something I haven't been in a long time." "What's the closest word?" She thought about it, genuinely, carefully. "Safe," she said, "which sounds small when I say it out loud. It doesn't sound small. It feels enormous." She looked at him. "I've been good at a lot of things. I built a company. I've managed loss and crisis, and I've done most of it without flinching. But I didn't know how to feel safe. I didn't know how to let someone close enough for that." She looked at his hand over hers. "You did something I didn't think was available to me anymore." "You did it," he said. "I just didn't leave." "That was the whole thing," she said. "That was the entire thing. You just didn't leave." It was such a simple statement of what love sometimes actually is that it sat between them in the kitchen quiet, like something real and solid, something you could put your hands on. Not romantic language, not a speech, just the true thing, said plainly. He stayed for that. They told Lily the next morning, or rather Lily saw the ring at breakfast because Lily missed very little, and said, "Is that new?" with her mouth full of toast, pointing at Victoria's hand. Victoria looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at Victoria. Lily looked at both of them with the patience of someone who has already understood the situation and is waiting for the adults to catch up. "Victoria and I are going to get married," Ethan said. Lily chewed her toast, swallowed. "I know," she said. "You know. I figured." She took another bite of toast. Then she looked at Victoria with the direct, clear assessment she'd had since the very first day at the museum, and she said, "Does that mean you're going to live here?" "Eventually, yes, if that's okay with you." Lily thought about it for approximately 2 seconds. "Can I have a fish tank?" "Lily," Ethan said, "I'm just asking if the rules are changing." Victoria looked at Lily. Lily looked at Victoria. "The fish tank is between you and your father," Victoria said. "But I'll mention that I think an octopus would be extremely impractical and probably not advisable." "I wasn't going to ask for an octopus." "I know. I'm just establishing where the line is in case you were thinking about it. Lily's eyes narrowed slightly, not with hostility, but with the specific assessment of a child figuring out how much she'd been read. I was a little thinking about it, she admitted. I know. Victoria said it without gloating. No octopus. A small fish tank. A small fish tank is your father's decision. Lily turned to Ethan. He held up one hand. Absolutely not during this meal. Lily accepted this with the philosophical resignation of someone who knew she had time. She went back to her toast. Then, without looking up, she said, I'm glad that you're getting married. Said it simply, to the table, the way she said important things. Not as a performance, just as a fact she was releasing into the room. I like having more people. Ethan felt something move through him. Victoria's hand, under the table, found his. What? The wedding was in November, which was Victoria's choice, and which Ethan understood without her explaining it. November was not February. It was not the hard month or the anniversary month. It was a neutral month, a month that didn't belong to anything yet, and making it belong to this, to them, was a deliberate act of replacing one association with another. He thought it was one of the more quietly strategic things she'd ever done, which was saying something. They kept it small, not out of embarrassment or concealment. Victoria had been at sufficient public events in her life that she was not going to be shy about her own wedding, but because neither of them was a person who needed a large audience for significant things, and the people who mattered could fit in a room without it being an event. Marcus was there, which was right. He stood near the back and cried, which he would later deny with a specificity that indicated he had prepared the denial in advance. Dr. Nwachukwu sent flowers and a note that said, in the therapist's characteristically economic language, "This is good work." Victoria put the note in the drawer of her bedside table, which was where she kept the things she actually meant to keep. The woman from the foundation event, the young one, mid-20s, the scarring on her neck and jaw, had sent a card after the event that Victoria had answered personally, and they had corresponded intermittently since then, a careful and genuine exchange between two people who understood something specific about each other without having to explain it. She was not at the wedding, but Victoria had thought about her that day, which was its own kind of presence. Victoria wore a dress that was not white, a deep burgundy, structured and clean, the kind of thing she'd always worn when she wanted to be exactly herself. And she wore sleeves that stopped at the elbow. The scarring was visible. She had not deliberated over this the way she'd deliberated over everything for 30 years. She had simply chosen the dress and the sleeve length, and that had been the decision. Ethan wore a suit that Lily had helped him choose, which meant it was slightly more interesting than what he'd have chosen on his own. He stood at the front of the room and watched Victoria walk toward him, and felt, as he had increasingly felt over the past year, the particular quiet of a person who is exactly where they're supposed to be, doing the exact thing they're supposed to be doing, not because the universe had arranged it, but because they had made choices, imperfect and sometimes frightened choices, that had led here. Lily was in a blue dress that she had selected entirely herself, and which had a sash that she had tied and retied approximately 7 times that morning before declaring it acceptable. She stood beside her father with the solemnity of someone who understood the weight of an occasion, and when the officiant got to the part about witnesses and support, Lily straightened up slightly, almost unconsciously, like someone accepting a responsibility. The vows were not written by anyone else. They'd each written their own, which Ethan had suggested and which Victoria had agreed to after a moment's consideration, saying only, "I'm better in writing than I am extemporaneously in emotional situations," which was the most Victoria sentence he'd ever heard. He went first. "I spent a long time," he said, "believing that what I had was enough, that I'd figured out the shape of my life, the shop, Lily, the routine of it, and that wanting more was a kind of ingratitude. I told myself that story for a long time." He looked at her. "And then I met you, and I understood that I hadn't figured anything out. I'd just gotten very good at not wanting what I was afraid I couldn't have." He paused. "You're the most honest person I've ever known. Not in a simple way, in the hard way. The way that costs something, that you have to choose every time, that doesn't come from having nothing to protect, but from protecting something that matters more." He felt his voice, doing a thing he hadn't planned for it to do and didn't try to correct it. I'm not going to stand here and tell you I'll always get it right. I'll get things wrong. I'll misread you sometimes, and there will be Februaries, and there will be things we can't fix for each other. But I'll stay. I told you that in a diner almost exactly a year ago, and I meant it then, and I mean it now more than I did then, which I didn't think was possible. He held her gaze. I'll always stay. Victoria was still. The particular stillness she had when she was holding something carefully. She unfolded the paper she'd written on, 2 pages, which was very her, and she looked at it for a moment, and then she folded it back up and set it on the small table beside her. I had something prepared, she said. I prepared it carefully, which is how I do everything, and it said what I meant to say with appropriate precision. She paused. But I think I'd rather just tell you. She looked at him. I spent 30 years building a life that couldn't be hurt. That's not a figure of speech. I was methodical about it. I kept everything at a distance that felt like safety and called it self-sufficiency, and I was very convincing about it, including to myself. Her voice was steady, but it was the active steadiness of someone choosing it. You were the first person in a very long time who didn't find that convincing, who didn't accept the performance as the person. A pause. I don't know what to say about what that meant, except that it changed things I'd believed were permanent about myself. And I want you to know that I know how rare that is. I know what it costs a person to stay when staying is hard, because I watched everyone else not do it, and I want you to know that I see that. I see what you've given me. She stopped. Lily, too. You gave me something I'd stopped believing was mine to have. Her voice went quieter. A family. That's the word. I don't say it lightly. A family. Lily made a small sound from beside Ethan. He glanced down. She was crying, silently and without apparent self-consciousness, in the specific way of children who don't yet know they're supposed to manage it. He put his arm around her. She leaned into him. Victoria looked at Lily for a moment, something moving across her face that she didn't try to contain, and then she looked at Ethan. I'll stay too, she said, as long as we have. They honeymooned for 5 days, which was what both of them could manage. Ethan had a job at the shop he couldn't leave longer than that, and Victoria had 3 things she was managing that she was not going to pretend she could fully switch off. And they had both agreed that 5 real days were worth more than 10 days of pretending to be fully elsewhere. They went somewhere warm and near the ocean, which was Lily's official request, even though she wasn't coming, communicated through Ethan with the authority of someone who felt her ocean interests should be represented. They sat on a beach for the first real morning and did not do very much. And it was enough. The ocean was loud and indifferent and vast, and the light was warm, and Victoria sat beside him with her feet in the sand in the late morning and her sleeves rolled back and her eyes closed against the sun. And she looked, it was the only word, unburdened. Not fixed, not resolved, not the finished product version of a person who has worked through something. Just unburdened, the way people looked when they'd set something down for a few minutes, even knowing they'd pick it back up later in some form. What are you thinking about? He asked. The water, she said. Just the water. She opened her eyes and looked at the ocean. I used to come to the shore when I was a child. Before. She didn't have to specify what before meant, not to him. My father had a boat, not a big one. He'd take us out early in the morning before it got hot, and my mother would pretend she wasn't nervous about the swells. A pause. I'd forgotten that. I hadn't thought about that specific memory in I don't know how long. Is it hard, thinking about it? She considered it honestly. A little, and also good. Both. She watched a wave come in. Dr. Nwachukwu says that's what integration looks like, when a memory can hold both things at once without one destroying the other. She paused. I'm not sure I fully have it yet, but I can feel the direction of it. He didn't say anything. The ocean kept doing what the ocean did. I should have come to the water sooner, she said. You came when you came. That sounds like something someone says when they want to be kind. I mean it practically, he said. You weren't ready before. Now you are. The before is just what happened. She looked at him. That's irritatingly logical. I fix things for a living. She laughed. That real laugh, the one that came from the less managed place. He'd stopped being surprised by it, which was itself something. You stopped being surprised by good things when they became part of the ordinary texture of your days, and he thought that was not complacency, but something better than that. The particular grace of having something long enough that it became simply yours. They came home to a house that Lily had decorated in their absence, which meant there were welcome back signs in her handwriting on the door and on the refrigerator and, for reasons that she explained only partially, on Gerald the coffee maker. She had also, apparently, spent some time reorganizing the bookshelf in the living room, moving Victoria's books, which had been in boxes since they'd moved some of her things over in September, onto the shelves with a system that turned out, upon inspection, to be a hybrid of the feeling order and something she described as the which one looks like you most order, which was unexplainable but somehow coherent. Victoria stood in the living room looking at the bookshelf. She mixed mine in with yours, she said. I see that. They're not organized by subject or author. No, they're not. But they're... She studied the shelf for a moment. Actually, they kind of make sense. Lily's systems usually do once you stop looking for conventional logic. Victoria reached out and touched the spine of one of her own books, sandwiched between one of Ethan's shop manuals and Lily's field guide to the ocean, the one she'd given Lily at Christmas nearly a year ago that had apparently graduated to the adult shelves. She stood there for a moment, her hand on the book. This is my home, she said. Not as a question, not as a statement requiring confirmation, just as a thing she was saying out loud because saying it out loud was different from knowing it. Yeah, he said, it is. She turned around. Her face was... It was her face, all of it, the lines and the intelligence and the silver hair and the something underneath that he'd been learning since October. The thing that the performance had been built to protect, and that was, now, more often than not, simply visible. She looked like a person who had arrived somewhere. Not at an ending, at a place. I want to tell you something, she said. Okay. I don't tell you enough. I'm not good at the ongoing, the day-to-day expressions of... She stopped, restarted. You are the reason I can stand in this room feeling what I feel right now. I know you'll say that's not right, that I did the work, that it was in me. And maybe that's partially true. But without you, I would have kept it at a distance for the rest of my life. I would have kept funding programs from a safe remove and wearing long sleeves in August and making sure nothing got close enough to hurt. She held his gaze. You are the reason I opened the windows. All of them. He crossed the room and held her, and she let him, completely, without the slight physical reservation she'd had for months after February, that ghost of the old habit. She held him back. From upstairs came the sound of Lily's thunderous arrival at the top of the stairs, her voice preceding her by a full 5 seconds. Are you home? Gerald's light is on, which means someone made coffee. She appeared at the top of the stairs, saw them, and slowed to a dignified pace as she came down, clearly deciding it would not be cool to run. Hi, she said, with the careful composure of a 7-year-old pretending she hadn't just been shouting. Hi, Ethan said, stepping back from Victoria. How was the trip? It was good. How was Mrs. Park? Good. She made the soup. Gerald worked fine the whole time. Lily came the rest of the way down the stairs, looked at them both with the assessing clarity she'd always had, and appeared to find whatever she was looking for. Did you see the shelf? We saw the shelf, Victoria said. I put your books in. She was trying not to sound proud of it, and not succeeding. You had a lot. I did. Some of them are kind of hard-looking. Some of them are. Lily considered this for a moment. I can read them eventually, she said, when I'm older. Can I read them in the feeling order? Victoria looked at her for a moment. Yes, she said. I think that's probably the best order. Lily nodded, satisfied, and went to the kitchen to investigate the coffee situation with the seriousness the subject deserved, and Ethan and Victoria stood in the living room of the house they now shared, in the ordinary particular mess and warmth of it, and there was nothing left to resolve. That was the thing, the actual thing. Not that everything was easy, not that the hard parts had been erased. February would come again, and the guilt would still be there in some form, quieter but present. There would be board meetings that wore her thin, and mornings when Ethan was too tired to be patient, and evenings when Lily needed more than either of them had ready. The 1968 Mustang was still in the shop, Gerald still made the noise. But they had built something. That was the word Victoria would have chosen, and it was the right one. Not found it, not fallen into it. Built it, the way you built things that mattered, slowly, with imperfect materials, by showing up daily with what you had and doing the next necessary thing. There's a version of love that the world tends to celebrate, the dramatic kind, the cinematic kind, the kind that announces itself in grand gestures and arrives with a score. And there is another kind, quieter and less photographable, that consists almost entirely of staying, of choosing, again, to stay. In the middle of February and the collapsed evenings and the things that don't resolve cleanly, of making coffee in a kitchen that isn't yours and becoming gradually the reason someone opens their windows, of learning that safety is not a small word, that presence is not a passive thing, that the most significant thing you can offer another person is not rescue. No one can rescue anyone else. That's the flat truth of it, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. But witness, to say, I see you, the whole version, and I'm not going anywhere. Ethan Mercer had not walked into that restaurant a year ago expecting any of this. He'd walked in expecting to have dinner with a stranger and go home. He had not known, at 33, with oil still faintly under his nails and a 7-year-old asleep at home with Mrs. Park, that the particular shape of his life was about to change into something larger than what he'd allowed himself to want. And Victoria Ashcroft had walked in prepared, as she had been prepared for 20 years, to show someone the thing that ended things and watch them go. She had arrived at that dinner already holding the distance, already managing the exit. She had not known how to believe in someone staying, because no one had. And then someone did, and kept doing it, and that was the whole story. Not the age difference, which people had opinions about, as predicted, and which mattered less the more time passed until it mattered about as much as the color of the walls. Not the fire, not the scars, not the long, complicated architecture of who they each were before they arrived at each other. Just that. The staying. The daily, imperfect, non-cinematic decision to stay. Lily called from the kitchen. Victoria, do you want tea or is this a coffee day? Victoria looked at Ethan once, briefly, with the expression he'd been reading for a year now, the one that looked like recalibration but was actually something simpler, arrival. The repeated daily fact of arriving somewhere you meant to be. Tea, she called back. Thank you, Lily. Okay, but the cups are on the high shelf, and I need someone tall. I'm coming, Victoria said, and she went to the kitchen, and Ethan stood for a moment in the living room with the mismatched bookshelves and the soccer ball by the door and the welcome back sign in Lily's spelling still taped to the refrigerator visible from where he stood. And he thought, yes, this is it. Not perfect, not resolved into something frictionless and easy, just real and theirs and ongoing, which was the only kind of thing worth building in the first place. He followed them into the kitchen.